Even beneath a sky filled with satellites, some islands remain perfectly visible on screen, yet almost unwilling to accept human footsteps. GPS can guide a vessel to the exact coordinates, but the final wave, ice field, or cliff still makes the decision. Aircraft have made the world smaller, yet these islands preserve one stubborn question. How does anyone actually get ashore? For most viewers, Google Earth may be the closest expedition they will ever make to places this remote. This countdown ranks 9 islands by distance, transportation, landing conditions, weather, and the restrictions surrounding access. At number 8, a tiny Pacific community still measures connection to the outside world through infrequent arriving ships. At number 6, the journey from Australia alone consumes roughly 2 weeks aboard a dedicated research vessel. At number 3, the ocean is not the strongest barrier. The legal boundary is the one nobody should cross. At number 2, there is no airport, meaning every road connecting the community to the world begins at sea. At number 1, the nearest land remains roughly 1,700 kilometers away, and that land is Antarctica. Distance is merely the opening obstacle, because the final minutes offshore can outweigh days spent crossing an ocean. An island closer to civilization can remain almost unreachable without a harbor, with powerful swell or beneath surrounding ice. And in some places, nature is not the only gatekeeper. Conservation laws also tell visitors where they must stop. These 9 isolated points stretch from the North Atlantic to the cold waters near Antarctica's outer edge. But the journey begins with number 9, far beyond the western coastline of Scotland. From Scotland, the view leaves the mainland, glides across Atlantic waters, and moves toward the Outer Hebrides. Farther west, small volcanic masses break away from every familiar coastline and stand alone in the North Atlantic. From orbit, they seem like harmless green specks. In reality, cliffs begin rising through curtains of sea mist. At number 9, St Kilda rises like a green fortress sculpted for centuries by relentless North Atlantic winds. Reaching Herta requires crossing exposed ocean, then waiting patiently until wind and waves permit entry into Village Bay. Yet generations once built lives here, raising the question of what finally persuaded them to abandon their home. In 1930, the remaining residents chose evacuation, closing the final chapter of traditional permanent settlement across the islands. St Kilda belongs to Scotland, lies about 66 kilometers west of Benbecula, and consists of volcanic islands. From high above, Herta resembles soft green pasture. Descend closer, and those slopes suddenly collapse into the sea. Beyond Village Bay, the coastline becomes cliffs and sea stacks taking the full force of the Atlantic. Even after reaching Herta, visitors must pass biosecurity controls designed to keep harmful organisms away from the island. By 1930, the last community was squeezed between isolation, difficult supplies, and a population growing smaller each year. They packed their possessions, left stone homes behind, and boarded boats from the same bay that had sustained them. As the vessel departed Village Bay, centuries of daily island life suddenly passed from routine into memory. That same isolation transforms St Kilda into an enormous breeding ground for nearly 1 million seabirds at seasonal peak. Today, no traditional village population remains permanently, but St Kilda continues to be protected, managed, and scientifically studied. At St Kilda, the sea grants or removes permission to land. The next destination makes the voyage itself far longer. At number 8, Pitcairn appears as a tiny green volcanic mass drifting alone across the South Pacific. The familiar passenger route runs by ship from Mangareva to Pitcairn, normally requiring about 2 nights each way. Remarkably, an island with no airport at all still supports a community numbering only a few dozen residents. Its story reaches back to 1790, when those aboard the Bounty chose Pitcairn as a place to disappear. Pitcairn is a British overseas territory and the only inhabited island within its 4-island group. On Google Earth, Pitcairn seems compact, but Bounty Bay provides only a small gateway beneath steep terrain. When the ocean changes character, transfers from larger ships into local boats can be halted without warning. But touching shore is still not the finish, because the hill of difficulty rises sharply toward Adamstown. In January 1790, the Bounty reached Pitcairn after Fletcher Christian searched for somewhere beyond familiar shipping routes. They anchored in Bounty Bay, unloaded their possessions, and dragged everything up the steep road into the interior. The Bounty was later burned, turning their only escape into ashes and forcing a refuge to become a settlement. Isolation once helped the new community disappear from the map. Today, that same distance continues shaping daily life. Ships remain an essential passenger lifeline, while commercial filming activities still require approval from the island authorities. Pitcairn still has people waiting for ships. The next destination depends almost entirely on an elaborate supply system. At number 7, Kerguelen spreads like a maze of cold bays and gray rock across the southern Indian Ocean. The archipelago has no regular connection except by sea, with 4 annual supply rotations departing from Réunion. Yet nobody lives there permanently, so who exactly is waiting for ships traveling thousands of kilometers into isolation? The answer is rotating scientists and technicians responsible for French research programs, equipment, and infrastructure. Kerguelen forms part of the French southern and Antarctic lands, deep within the southern Indian Ocean. From orbit, its coastline resembles branching routes. Lower down, mountains and wind turn every bay into its own world. Marion Dufresne cannot use a pier designed for large ships, forcing it to remain offshore from Port-au-Français. Even after arriving there, people and cargo must continue onward by helicopter or aboard the barge L'Aventure E. Every supply rotation begins in Réunion with fuel, food, and equipment prepared for weeks of isolation. The ship then cuts through the roaring 40s and furious 50s during a logistics journey approaching a month. Reaching Kerguelen only completes half the story, because unloading still requires constant negotiation with wind and sea. That very isolation makes Kerguelen a natural laboratory for studying climate, oceans, and southern ecosystems. With no permanent civilian population, every research season hangs from a logistics chain stretching across the ocean. Kerguelen requires an entire supply route to function. The next island makes simply placing people ashore even harder. At number 6, Heard Island compresses glaciers, violent ocean, and an active volcano into one extraordinary landscape. From Hobart, RSV Nuyina requires around 2 weeks simply to reach the waters surrounding this distant island. No one lives there permanently, yet Australia still sends an icebreaker, helicopters, and scientific teams to its shores. They travel there to monitor an almost pristine ecosystem alongside constantly changing glaciers and volcanic activity. Heard belongs to Australia, but lies about 4,000 kilometers southwest of the continent in the cold Southern Ocean. On Google Earth, it resembles a white stain. Closer down, glaciers crawl from mountains toward exposed rocky shores. With no permanent roads or transport network, the 2025 expedition carried 2 helicopters and 3 research boats. Yet even after the ship arrives, powerful winds can hold the entire expedition offshore and keep land beyond reach. The 2025-2026 Australian mission first had to rebuild Atlas Cove Camp before scientists could operate ashore. When weather cracked the door open, helicopters moved people in and teams quickly spread out to survey wildlife and vegetation. In January 2026, one final brief weather window allowed helicopters to return 20 people to the island. Above them stands Big Ben, the highest active volcano in Australian territory, surrounded by immense flowing glaciers. Every visit to Heard is tightly controlled, and activities ashore must meet Australia's strict environmental requirements. Heard lets people step ashore only when weather relents. The next island once forced entire expeditions to turn away. At number 5, Peter I Island rises from Antarctic waters like a white fortress sealed behind ice. Sea ice can close the route long before arrival, while steep shores leave boats only a few possible approaches. The paradox is that explorers saw the island in 1821, yet the discovering expedition could not step onto it. More than a century passed before the Norvegia expedition achieved the first known landing in 1929. Peter I is an island claimed by Norway, positioned offshore from Antarctica's Ellsworth Land. From above, it resembles an icy shield. Near the water, that smooth whiteness suddenly ends in sheer rock. First comes ice, then surf, and finally steep terrain, turning the last few meters into the least predictable part. Even modern expeditions must remain completely self-sufficient while following strict regulations governing activity in Antarctica. In 1821, Fabian von Bellingshausen sighted Peter I, but ocean and weather conditions denied him a landing. His ship continued onward, leaving a newly mapped island still without any confirmed footsteps on its shore. On February 2nd, 1929, the Norwegia expedition finally crossed the coastline and stepped onto Peter I. Beneath that ice lies a volcanic island, crowned by Lars Christiansen at roughly 1,640 meters. Peter I still receives remarkably few visitors, and every arrival must be prepared like a true expedition. Peter I could be clearly seen, yet remained beyond reach. The next island turns inaccessibility into its actual name. At number 4, Inaccessible Island encloses a green plateau behind a near-continuous wall of South Atlantic cliffs. Most of its coast is vertical rock, while the few narrow beaches become usable only when the ocean settles. Ironically, the island named Inaccessible protects a creature that cannot leave it by flying. The Inaccessible Island rail exists nowhere else and is widely regarded as the world's smallest flightless bird. The island belongs to the Tristan da Cunha group and is an extinct volcano with a plateau around 449 meters. On Google Earth, its summit resembles a green tabletop. Lower the viewpoint, and that tabletop becomes a wall. Visiting vessels cannot remain anchored overnight, while heavy swell can erase an entire landing window. Even calm water is not enough, because access remains restricted to protect the island's wildlife populations. In 2011, oil from the wreck of Milliseconds Oliva near Nightingale reached coastal areas around Inaccessible Island. Conservation teams use small boats to reach coastal rookeries, but many sites opened only when waves briefly eased. Rough seas delayed checks at several breeding areas, while oil-affected birds still required urgent assistance. The absence of introduced mammals has allowed Inaccessible to preserve a rare, largely intact temperate island ecosystem. Today, it belongs to the Guff and Inaccessible World Heritage Site, with landings remaining tightly controlled. Nature builds a wall of stone here. The next island adds another boundary that people are expected to respect. At number 3, a forest-covered island sits behind shallow tropical waters within India's Andaman archipelago. There is no harbor or tourism infrastructure, and neither the reef nor shoreline exists for routine visitation. But the question here is not how someone could land. It is why outsiders should never attempt it. India protects the entire island and the sea extending 5 kilometers around its coast as a tribal reserve. North Sentinel belongs to India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands, in waters east of the Bay of Bengal. Google Earth shows forest covering almost everything, leaving only a narrow shoreline between green canopy and ocean. Authorities follow a policy of observation without interference, intended to preserve the isolation of the Sentinelese people. For that reason, even mirror-calm seas cannot transform an illegal landing into an acceptable journey. In 2025, an American citizen entered the restricted area and was later arrested by Indian police. The incident demonstrated that navigation technology may locate an island, but grants nobody permission to cross protected boundaries. Authorities stress that unauthorized contact could threaten both the safety and health of the Sentinelese community. Current policy rests on one clear principle. Their isolation is not an achievement for outsiders to conquer. North Sentinel remains protected, while its population and internal life cannot be accurately determined from outside. North Sentinel may be visible from orbit, but the correct distance here is the distance that remains untouched. At number 2, Tristan da Cunha raises an enormous green volcano from the emptiness of the South Atlantic. There is no airport. The normal journey begins in Cape Town and continues for days entirely by ship. Yet beyond that long voyage sits a permanent community with homes, a school, and a tiny harbor. In 2026, a medical situation exposed that isolation dramatically when urgent supplies had to arrive from the sky. Tristan is a British overseas territory, roughly 2,800 kilometers from Cape Town, with only a few hundred residents. On Google Earth, the mountain occupies almost everything, while the settlement clings to a narrow coastal plain. Ocean-going vessels are too large for Calshot Harbor, so they anchor offshore and transfer passengers into smaller craft. But reaching Tristan by ship does not guarantee landing, because both the voyage and shore transfer depend on weather. In May 2026, Britain needed to deliver urgent medical supplies to a community with no runway whatsoever. And a 400M left Ascension, refueled in flight, and continued directly toward the airspace above Tristan. The aircraft swept over the settlement and parachuted supplies down, yet there was still nowhere for it to land. Across generations, Tristan residents have learned to live by ship schedules, weather, and the limited resources of isolation. Visitors still need advance permission, space aboard a vessel, and acceptance that schedules can change without warning. Tristan proves a community can survive without an airport. The final island does not even have residents awaiting ships. At number 1, Bouvet Island is a lonely mass of ice and rock that seems almost forgotten by the planet. It lies about 2,500 kilometers from South Africa, while drowning Maud Land remains roughly 1,700 kilometers away. The paradox is that Bouvet's nearest land still belongs to Antarctica's edge, so why do people continue coming? Norway maintains the seasonal Norvegia station to monitor seals, penguins, and populations of seabirds. Bouvet is a Norwegian volcanic island covering roughly 49 square kilometers, with nearly 89% buried beneath ice. On Google Earth, it resembles a white dome. Descend toward the ocean, and that dome fractures into black cliffs. There is no pier or sheltered harbor, while sheer rock and heavy swell make boat landings exceptionally dangerous. Even helicopters, the safer practical alternative, require special authorization before they are permitted to touch down. Norwegian Polar Institute teams therefore bring their own logistics, equipment, and complete safety systems whenever they visit. When weather permits, helicopters carry people and equipment from the vessel to Neuroisa and its seasonal station. Then, fog can seal the island again within moments, leaving helicopters waiting while the destination sits tantalizingly close. Bouvet's isolation has prevented established introduced species, making strict biosecurity an especially important priority. Bouvet has been protected as a nature reserve since 1971, with human activity subjected to exceptionally tight controls. Bouvet's coordinates can be perfectly precise, yet ocean, cliffs, fog, and distance still hold the final authority. From St Kilda to Bouvet, 9 tiny islands reveal 9 different ways Earth can keep human beings outside. Some use distance, others waves, ice, cliffs, weather, or legal boundaries that must remain respected. Technology lets humanity observe, measure, and study these places remotely, but it still cannot cancel nature's limits. Of these 9 islands, which one is worth the journey, and which is better experienced only through a screen? If geographic expeditions like these fascinate you, subscribe to the channel and share your choice in the comments. Bouvet slowly dissolves into the fog, reminding us that Earth still holds places visible, yet never entirely ours.